We got our first taste of Broncos preseason action as Denver stomps the backup squad for the San Francisco 49ers. So which players popped and which are maybe finding themselves a little bit behind the eight ball with a couple of preseasons left to go? Plus, should Sean Payton's offense have looked a little bit more buttoned up given the preparation and lead-in time that we had and what we saw from the joint practices just a couple of days before? And what do we make of the tale of two drives for Vance Joseph's defense, where they started out looking a little lethargic and then seemed to return with a little bit more of an identity that we are used to? All things to come on today's rundown, but I want to begin with a little bit of, let's call it stock watch, right? Because during this preseason evaluation period for Sean Payton, George Payton, and the Denver Broncos, that's essentially what we're doing, is we are watching the way that certain players who may or may not be fighting for spots on a limited 53-man and 48-man game day roster. And these preseason evaluations, from the practice periods and training camp to the joint practice periods and the games themselves, are opportunities for those players' stocks to either rise or fall on a play-to-play, series-to-series, game-to-game, and week-to-week basis. So if we were taking this Broncos 49ers game into account and we're looking at risers, well, there's certainly a handful of names that come to mind. Most chiefly, for me, Troy Franklin. Boy, you're talking about a guy who last season, coming off of being a mid-round pick, somebody who is highly touted going into the 2024 season because of his already baked-in connection with Bo Nix, who he caught passes from at the University of Oregon, and now it comes to Denver. But during the 2024 campaign, it just never seemed to click. It was always a half a step here, half a step there. He seemed to be frustrated and maybe struggling with a limited route tree and an ability to grasp the game from a mental standpoint that allowed him to maximize the clear physical gifts that he has. We saw just flashes of it here and there, culminating most recently with the opening scoring drive and touchdown of the wild card game against the Buffalo Bills, where they finally, Bo and Troy, connected on one of those deep balls, and it just showed you that tantalizing morsel that's there, leaving us wanting more. Well, this has been somewhat of an off season of Troy Franklin in terms of the step he's taking from year one to year two. We've seen it manifest itself in training camp. And similar to the way that we saw the running backs last season and this offseason duke it out in a room that doesn't have a clear-cut starter, with last year it was Javonte, Jaleel, and Audric Estime, and neither one of them, none of the three of them, could take the reins and firmly grasp that starting role. And this offseason, while it feels pretty clear that the starting duties are going to be handled primarily by J.K. Dobbins and R.J. Harvey, the two newcomers via free agency and the draft, it's that RB3 spot that is similarly up for grabs, and we will see kind of which back tends to emerge. A little bit more on that later. But for Troy Franklin, moving into this offseason, he has seemed more confident, more explosive, more dynamic, and clearly more on the same page with not just Bo Nix, his quarterback, but with his place within Sean Payton's offense. And given what we saw during the preseason game against the 49ers, it really does feel like Troy Franklin has as good a chance as anybody to really grab hold of that wide receiver 2 spot that has been up for grabs since last season. On the running back room, if we're talking about risers and fallers, Tyler Bidet, we talked about it last week, toward the end of last week, about, hey, don't be surprised if Tyler Bidet potentially plays spoiler and comes from the cheap seats to steal this RB3 spot behind J.K. Dobbins and R.J. Harvey. And I don't know how you watched that preseason game against the 49ers and thought to yourself, well, that doesn't seem reasonable. Jaleel McLaughlin looked a little bit flashy like we saw in the preseason last offseason, where Sean Payton said he had to change his plan for a guy like Jaleel McLaughlin. And we saw it in spurts during the regular season, but it seems like some of the same limitations for Jaleel. If he's unable to beat the defender to the edge and try to use that speed to turn things upfield from the outside, he doesn't have as much flexibility and dynamic ability from a skill set perspective to run between the tackles. And he had opportunities to get outside, got tripped up after a couple of yards. He had one great run called back thanks to a holding penalty, which certainly doesn't help his case and opportunity to try to move forward. Something that Sean Payton and company will see on film, but that's just the reality of football, is that sometimes those plays are going to be called back, and there needs to be enough frequency to be able to generate offensive production like that to overcome and withstand some of those limitations. Tyler Bidet, though, pops off for a couple of big runs, shows his prowess and his ability on special teams to be able to carve out a multifaceted role there. If we're talking stocks, Tyler Bidet's stock is slowly but surely getting more and more expensive as training camp and now the first preseason week rolls on. Conversely, it was a situation with a guy like Audric Estime that we've talked about, where he's already kind of felt like the odd man out in that room, peeking from the outside, even though he was a 5th-round draft pick just a year ago and somebody that Sean Payton had a vision for. There just wasn't enough juice and pop overall with the opportunities for you to sit there and say, hey, we can't count this guy out yet. Now, it's just one preseason game, and these kind of evaluations and things take time, and a lot of these decisions may run all the way up to the final quarter of the final preseason game to hammer out some of those spots. Usually, there's probably more of an evolved thought process going into that, and we're really not talking about a significant amount up for grabs going into the final preseason game. But this RB3 room literally could come down to that, and our eyes will be on who's taking those carries in the fourth quarter of that final game to kind of see where this coaching staff and organization is trending. So there are those who believe Jaleel McLaughlin already has this roster spot kind of locked up and he's going to make the team hell or high water. Maybe he's an incumbent from last season and he's certainly in better footing than the other incumbent in Audric Estime. But the more that I watch Tyler Bidet, the more that it really does seem to me like you can get some of the same skill set and ability, especially from a speed and a burst perspective, that you get out of Jaleel McLaughlin, but you get highly touted pass protection that Sean Payton has brought up multiple times. You get a clearly defined special teams role for him. And that leaves 2 guys from last season, the entirety of the running back room at that point, on the outside looking in or just completely gone, like Javonte Williams going to the Cowboys. On the defensive side of the ball, if you're talking about the one major riser that's still turning heads, it's Nik Bonitto. The defense as a whole seemed to come out a little bit slow. They looked a little bit lethargic, especially considering this was the 49ers B squad for the majority of those early reps. There wasn't really as much starter rotations mixed in. Kyle Shanahan was adamant about that during their approach to the joint practice period. And the result was the Broncos starting defense got dog walked on an 8-play drive for a scoring touchdown led by Mac Jones. And the deep play to Watkins beating Jaquan McMillan, who by and large had about as good a coverage as you could have asked for in many situations from a positioning standpoint. And it was just a better throw and a better catch by Watkins and Mac Jones. But that set off a chain of events that led to an 8-play scoring drive where the Broncos defense against San Francisco backups seemed to be a little bit behind the 8 ball in that regard. Now, just like the offense, who came out a little bit slow and lethargic and stayed for maybe more plays and series than we thought they would, VJ's defense went out there for consecutive series after that. And Nik Bonitto, along with the rest of his defensive unit, seemed to kind of respond to that wake-up call. Bonitto himself being responsible for blowing up an entire series almost alone with 3 consecutive plays with a sack of Mac Jones, a virtual half sack of Mac Jones, and then a pressure that forced Mac Jones so far out of the pocket and twisted back around that the 49ers were unable to maximize anything offensively. So for a guy that is next in line and certainly on the radar of George Payton and Sean Payton to get a big contract extension, Nik Bonitto showed that his stock at an already expensive rate still has room to grow. And then there's Justin Strnad, right? And this is an interesting one given the dynamic of the inside linebacker room. But with the absence of Alex Singleton, the absence of Dre Greenlaw, and health being a major factor in that room, with the likes of Drew Sanders, a key backup and position player in that inside linebacker room, also being limited in the preseason and may bleed over from a recovery standpoint into the regular season. Seeing Justin Strnad show capable ability in the run and the pass game to be able to hold things down in the middle in a duty and a spot situation that he very well likely could be called into was very encouraging to me, because I am already factoring in mentally that with Alex Singleton and Dre Greenlaw both coming off of significant lower body injuries in their recent seasons, and both guys getting nicked and banged up to a certain degree already in this preseason, that the depth of that inside linebacker room is once again going to be tested, regardless of what the magic of Bo Lowry and his strength and conditioning staff can muster up. The likes of Lavelle Bailey and Justin Strnad, and perhaps even Drew Sanders, if he clears this hurdle and is able to be a part of the team on IR and come back during the regular season, all of those depth backup level players in that inside linebacker room, I think could very well see contributing time beyond special teams in the regular season. So for Justin Strnad, the ability to show capability and functionality in that role, to me, was an encouraging thing to see. If you want to zoom out to a macro perspective, though, we had talked about this all week leading into it. I know Zach By and I got into it on the drive about kind of the way that we're evaluating the offense as a whole, with Sean Payton going into year 3 and year 2 with Bo Nix, and Vance Joseph's defense, given the new pieces and things that have been added on each side, and they have been significant. I made the analogy that if we're talking about the Broncos offense as a car last offseason and Bo Nix is the driver, well, the car that we were driving last offseason that Bo was behind the wheel of, going into this offseason and heading into the 2025 regular season, that car's had a lot of modifications. We've added spinners. We turbocharged it. There's fuzzy dice on the mirror, and it drives differently than it did last season. It wasn't a situation where we get behind the wheel and we're basically running it back with the exact same supporting cast and surrounding cast, just with elevations at each position. No. Evan Ingram coming in to be the Joker changes the dynamic nature of this offense. It changes the complexity of what they're going to run and the way the scheme is implemented. The additions of J.K. Dobbins and R.J. Harvey change the way the run game is going to look. It's moving to more of an outside zone run scheme compared to what we saw last season. And that changes the assignments of the offensive lineman from a blocking perspective. It changes the timing and the cadence between the quarterback and the running back. The way that the wide receiver 2 battle shakes out changes the way the weapons are deployed on the field. If it's Devon Vele, like it seemed maybe early on in this offseason to kind of be trending toward, that looks different, and it moves Marvin Mims into other spots alongside Evan Ingram as chess pieces to move across the board. If it's Pat Bryant or Troy Franklin, who is having a strong preseason leading into this game against the 49ers, all of these things change the way that it looks, and it changes the way that Sean Payton calls the game. So while we haven't been able to see or say that the offense has truly won a period going into, I should say not a period, a day going into week 1 of the preseason with the training camp practices we've had thus far, it was a major evaluation point to finally see them go against another unit. And frankly, the early returns for the starting unit were disappointing. Now, it's very limited from an opportunity standpoint, and that has to be factored in as well. But it was a little flat. It looked like Bo Nix was a little bit jittery and out of sync. He hits Cortland Sutton on a normal would-be connection, and this time it's just a little bit over the fingertips, and Sutton's not able to make one of those magical fingertip diving catches that we've seen him make. There were some checkdowns to the running backs that didn't really amount to much or leave much opportunity for a guy to make a play out in space. There was some disjointed nature in the run game, specifically with R.J. Harvey, who, while you could certainly take a look at the tape from the game against the 49ers and say, hey, that already looks a little bit better or at least similar to what we saw from the best of the running backs last season, which I think is a positive sign. But it did feel like there was a lot of bouncing to the outside for a guy like RJ Harvey, and something that I don't think you're going to get away with at the NFL level with the edge protection and the prowess and the strength that teams have on the edges at the NFL level compared to what you did in college. I think Cecil Lammey laid out a stat earlier today that said north of 70% of RJ Harvey's carries in college went outside the tackles. That's not going to be the case in the NFL, and something that Sean Payton is going to have to factor in and consider when they're talking about scheming up this run game as a way to set up what he ultimately wants to do, which we all know is chuck the ball around the yard. And then the defense, who have been rightfully heralded as potentially one of the best units in the entire NFL. And yet we see them come out for a couple of drives against the 49ers B squad, and they got pushed around a little bit. There was a 3rd and short situation that the 49ers were able to convert, where that vaunted front four with DJ Jones and Zach Allen and even the edge pressure of Nick Bonito and Jonathan Cooper, it got blown back. And this is a strength and an area of the defense that has a lot of money and a lot of talent locked up and invested in it. And we're not talking about starters at this point. We're talking about backups, talking about practice. We saw them come out with maybe a slight sense of overconfidence and overlooking the task that was at hand because of the work that they got put in during the joint practices, and then you head into the game. And it was encouraging to see Nick Bonito and others rebound from that. You saw him, as we mentioned earlier, Nick Bonito wreck an entire series all by himself with 3 persistent pressures in the backfield, leading to what would amount, in my eyes, to 1.5 sacks, 1 for sure. And then you saw Jaquan McMillan get an interception on the sideline after getting beat on that opening play. We mentioned the likes of Justin Strnad and what he was able to do in a fill-in capacity. And so it was good to see them respond. But overall, I think one of my takeaways was this. It was an underwhelming performance, I think, for the Broncos offense from a starting group. They did not look as connected and as in rhythm as I thought and hoped that they might. There were flashy contributions and moments. Devon Vele had a nice catch. Pat Bryant, obviously, each of the running backs found a way to contribute in some way. Tyler Bidet certainly maybe more than some of the others fighting for that RB3 spot. And Bo Nix just looked a little off. It didn't seem to be clicking the way that you would want. That's a limited sample size, and it's the first preseason game. But I was encouraged by the depth performances from Jared Stidham at the quarterback position all the way to the likes of Trent Sherfield and Tyler Bidet. That showed me that the Broncos do have quality depth on offense. And the same should be said about the defensive side of the ball, who, despite the first drive for the San Francisco 49ers against the Broncos starters going down the field for a touchdown, and then Bo Nix giving up a safety shortly after to produce 9 unanswered points, it was the depth players on both sides of the ball that really showed mettle in those situations. The backup offense goes for 30 unanswered points, and the backup defense doesn't allow any more bleeding to stop after that initial 9-point score. So all in all, I felt encouraged about the depth pieces behind the starting units and what they're going to be able to provide potentially for this Broncos team on both sides of the ball. There was more encouragement there for me than there was discouragement about what I saw initially from the starters. And that could change pending how some of these other evaluations, especially in this next preseason game, where it'll be the last opportunity for a lot of starters, pans out. There's going to be so much to keep track of this week. The Broncos are back in action at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit, tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday for the final 3 training camp practices here in town with the fans, leading into the second week of the preseason as the regular season creeps closer and closer. Stay locked into Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan for all things Broncos training camp. Nobody does football in this town better than 104.3 The Fan. And you've got, on top of that, the multifaceted and ever-expanding crew at DenverSports.com, the likes of Will Peterson, Jake Shapiro, Trent Finnegan, Cecil Lammy, Andrew Mason, Anilo Piro, all of those resources available to you online, all the articles you can read, all the videos you can watch, columns, breakdowns from Andrew Mason from practice every single day, instant breaking news updates, and then all of our social media channels from YouTube to Instagram to Facebook and TikTok, all available to you, pumping out and repurposing so much content 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Wherever you have content needs that you want to fill, Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan has them here for you. So like and subscribe to our channels, follow us on social, and stay dialed in for all things Denver Broncos with the regular season just around the corner. We'll catch you live at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit, tomorrow.